Hello, welcome to MD Media Show. Today we'll be conversing on In God's Name, the anatomy of demonization and radioactive enmity in Ethiopia. It's my great pleasure to have Andrew DeCort, who wrote recently an article on the foreign policy. Christian nationalism is tearing Ethiopia apart. I would use that as a starting material, but we will converse on the broader religion, politics, genocide, massacres, all that that has been going on in Ethiopia. And Andrew, it's a great pleasure. I see and I hear a background of birds singing where you are. So welcome to UMD Media.
It's good to be here, Getachew. Thanks for inviting me.
Awesome. I just we will talk about the article, and I saw on social media you are getting a lot of reaction, feedback, and I saw you reacting to some of them on that. And even today, you had to talk about how rich you are or not when it comes to your time in Ethiopia. Maybe we should start for our audiences who haven't read this article and who don't know who you are. Who is Andrew DeCort?
It's a big question, Getachew. Thanks for asking it. I'm a human being. I was born. I love people. I make mistakes. I get things wrong. I try to learn. I'm someone who believes that everyone has equal value. Christians, Muslims, atheists, Buddhists, people of every ethnic background and heritage. I'm a scholar by training. I was trained in ethics at the University of Chicago with a focus on religious and political ethics. I've worked as a pastor, as a professor of ethics at Wheaton College, at the Ethiopian Graduate School of Theology, and the University of Bonn. I'm also a peace practitioner. I'm passionate about seeing people as equal in value rather than strangers or enemies. That's the heart of the work I've done with the Neighbor Love movement. Um, I'm a passionate person. I'm a person that loves people. I love learning. I love building relationship. And I believe in political responsibility for the common good of women and children and youth and men, the people who inhabit the body politic.
Great. Yeah, I've been following you for quite some time, and you mentioned about the neighbor love movement and everything you were saying about peace and neighborhood, all that are very important. Specifically, it's very important everywhere, but very relevant for where Ethiopia is, where Ethiopia has been, and so on. Um, One thing that maybe pushed you, in my view, to write that article is perhaps what has been going on Tigray, but we know that it's beyond Tigray as well. As we speak, just past days, what happened in Walega, in Gimbi, and before that in Gambela, Benshangul, all over the place, Gondar. Um, the suffering is everywhere. But when it comes to Tigray, we know multiple forces were involved, and we are still, the region is under siege, blockade, all that. So let's talk about your assessment, maybe first-hand experience of how we learned about the war, maybe the runner-up into November 4th, 2020. I I just want our readers to have a background in what we are going to talk about. How did you learn about the war?
Well, I think everybody felt the war was coming, Getachew. I don't know if the war really surprised anyone. I'm sad to say. We saw an escalation of enemy language happening in Ethiopia for an extended period of time. We saw the increasing use of dehumanizing language to refer to the enemy. Uh, this started before the war broke out. The other as a weed, the other as a cancer, the other as a demon or monster. We started to see public executions. If you recall the lynching of the man in Shashamani, a horrific public execution. We saw the burning of people alive in the heart of Hawassa. If you remember, that woman poured gasoline on the body of men and lit them on fire, and raised her hands in triumph over them. And we saw cyclical and increasing massacres of people throughout the country. And, you know, if you remember in the Gedeo and Guji conflict, there was the largest amount of displaced people in the world at that time over this conflict. And you know, this was spreading all throughout the country. And I think that people who were paying attention were really fearing that this conflict was going to really escalate and get out of control. And um, the Tigray war is, yeah, there are those terrible pictures. Those pictures were really important for the start of the Neighbor Love movement. When we saw these things, we said that we have to do something to elevate the value of human life. I think what's most disturbing to me about these pictures, Getachew, is you can see that there are lots of people watching and no one doing anything to defend these people. Now, I don't know who these people are, but I certainly know that no one deserves to die this way. So we were seeing the escalation of enemy rhetoric, and I always say, Getachew, that the war of words the war of words precedes the war of weapons, or the war of weapons begins in the war of words. And we were seeing this kind of language between the Tigray regional state, between the federal state, between Abiy and others. And so I don't think that the war really came as a huge surprise, although, you know, we heard about this invasion of this military base in Tigray, and then this was used as a kind of justification for the escalation of this conflict into full-scale invasion, although of course euphemisms were used. It wasn't called civil war, it was called a law enforcement operation. So this was building for many times, and I think that this rivalry that we're seeing taking place has been building for quite some time.
Mm-hmm. And then the war came, and I mean the picture you are painting before the war, like the internal displacement, the open square, execution, killing, burning, uh, is happening in, I mean, related to our topic, in a country, one faith or another claims to be, full of religious people, people of faith, right? Uh, but when it comes to Tigray, what you maybe didn't mention is how there was a blockade of roads, federal roads leading to Tigray in terms of food and all that. And
Yes.
then, and November 4th, the war started. And we saw all kinds of lethal weapons there, and a massive support for that war. I don't know if you were in Ethiopia at that point, but
I
uh,
was.
yeah. So again, what were you thinking? I mean, I think you started the neighbor love movement before that, right?
Yeah, in 2018.
In 2018. So the year Abiy Ahmed came to office, right? Uh, so what were you seeing in the people? I mean, we'll zoom in into the elite, into the faith elite, into the religious elite, specifically. But
Yeah.
what were you reading in terms of this massive support and mobilization?
You know, Getachew, I want to be clear from the very beginning that these kinds of conversations are difficult because they're so emotionally charged, and because um, they require so much complexity, and it's so easy to generalize and misrepresent. So I just want our viewers to know that I'm aware of the danger and problem of generalization, of misrepresentation, that can be unhelpful. Um, when the war started, I think some people were taken a little bit by surprise by the radioactive enmity that exploded. And this sense that people were getting what they deserved, that justice was being done against TPLF. Now, of course, Getachew, as you know, the insistence that this was only against TPLF, not the Tigrayan people. This was the distinction that was being used to justify this so-called law enforcement campaign. But what we saw was the catastrophic suffering and collective punishment of the Tigrayan people through the blockade that you described, through the devastation of infrastructure, through the mass looting, through the weaponized rape, um, through the horror stories that are uh, deeply traumatizing to even speak of, and that people have lived through and died in. And what became kind of shocking to me, Getachew, was the sense that this was justified, perhaps even that this was part of God's will, something that God had been planning for Ethiopia and Tigray. And I would say the hardening of heart was disappointing. You know, when you would try to talk about compassion, Getachew, I'm a Christian. I'm a deeply spiritual person. I believe that compassion is at the heart of any authentic faith. Judaism says that the Lord, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love. Jesus talks about God as the lover of the enemy. Prophet Muhammad calls Allah the merciful, the all compassionate. Compassion is at the heart of authentic faith. And what I discovered is that when you talked about compassion, people would immediately say, "Oh, you're TPLF. You are a supporter of terrorists. You are against Ethiopia. You want to destroy the state." This was deeply disappointing to me because, to be frank with you, Getachew, I have been openly critical of TPLF. I'm openly critical of TPLF to this day. But the Tigrayan people were made to experience collective punishment um, by the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, by Eritrean forces, and by other militia forces that could never be justified in any kind of morally legitimate vision. And so you asked me about the responses of people to the war, and what was disturbing to me was the sense that the very widespread sense that this was justified, that this may even be part of God's will, and that expressing compassion for suffering people was somehow an act of disloyalty, um, or an act of treachery or betrayal. The second you started speaking with concern about suffering people in Tigray, you immediately became suspicious and were tagged as, some secret agent, as if, to weep for suffering children somehow is a political act. Of course, it is a political act because it's saying that injustice shouldn't be done, but it's not an ideological act, and it's certainly not a kind of partisan act. It's a human act to weep on behalf of women and children. Of course, men as well. No one deserves to die. So that's some of what I was observing, was this hardening of the heart, and I even called it the criminalization of compassion at the time. Um, if you expressed compassion, you had become some kind of shadowy figure, some kind of highly suspicious secret agent. And of course, this was the very successful media campaign of the government, because for crimes to be perpetrated, the public's heart has to be hardened. We're going to talk about demonization. Demonization is an essential strategy for the infliction of collective punishment on another group of people, because in order for the people to tolerate it, they have to either accept that the victims deserve it, or they have to believe that the victims are not human, and so that the violence doesn't matter. And what we saw was this hardening of the heart. Now, I'm glad to say that I think that this is shifting. And again, I want to be careful not to paint with too broad a brush or to oversimplify. Um, but this point that I'm making about a sense of this is deserved, And if you have compassion for these suffering people, you are um, suspicious, or you have some sort of hidden agenda. This was deeply disturbing, Gaetacho, and it was a source of grief because, my brother, this is not political ping pong. It's not a game that you're trying to win, like, oh, our side got it right. No, this is people's lives. This is hunger. I ate lunch today. This is deeply personal when you think about there are many people who haven't had lunch today. There are many people who probably haven't eaten in several days. There may be people on the brink of death. This is not political. This is human. I could go on and on, but let me turn it back over to you.
Yeah, I think UMD Media purposely chose this name, understanding and measuring and doing. This is to capture what we identified as the cause of all or the mother of all problems. We don't understand that whatever we say, irresponsibly say or stand for, is easily translated as we speak into a suffering of a kid, a mom, a grandmother, a brother, all that. So this is what is happening and what has been happening. Uh, Maybe one thing that I will try to find it, but the price of speaking up,
Yeah.
not even speaking to power. I mean, just saying like showing compassion is so high that in Ethiopia that a famous artist, Gina,
Yes, that's right.
when he spoke of let's find other ways of dealing with this issue. I know firsthand. I buried my brothers in a war front, and I don't know if you followed that. What happened days after that was
Oh yeah,
he
he
had
was
to
he was
come
pushed
back
into
to
a
the media and cry, right?
public apology for crying out for peace, Getachew, for saying we should send our elders to beg for peace. He had to do a public apology for that.
Exactly, exactly. So the reason we need to, paint that picture is it's again this backdrop that you wrote this article, Christian nationalism is tearing Ethiopia apart. You yourself as a pastor, as a professor of ethics, all that, and even before that, I will be mentioning what you wrote before that on Abuna Matthias, on Daniel Kabrat, on Mekane Jesus. So
Yeah.
you were speaking up about this on the platforms you had. So the question to you, Andrew, is why is it important for you to write about this extensive article? And I gather that you had to reduce the number of words, even if this is already long article. What why is it important personally for you to write about this?
Yes. You know, Getachew, I told you that I'm a Christian, and I'm an ethicist. I'm someone who believes in human dignity, and I have been formed in an ethical tradition from the Hebrew Bible that says, "Speak on behalf of those who cannot speak for themselves. Cry out for the rights of the orphan and the widow." That's Proverbs chapter 30. Um, I've also been formed in the tradition of the Hebrew prophets. Isaiah said to the people of Israel, I'm not interested in your prayer, your offerings, your singing, your fasting. What God wants is justice and concern for the fatherless, for the orphan and the widow, for the foreigner, for the outcast. But, Jesus put this at the center. Jesus said that we can perform all of these kinds of religious activities, but what God really cares about is um, justice and integrity. And this puts children at the heart of it. Jesus said that the most important people in the heart of God are the naked, the thirsty, the hungry, the imprisoned, the sick, and the foreigner. Now, Getachew, doesn't that sound like war victims to you? A naked, thirsty, hungry, sick, foreigner, no documentation, imprisoned, punished by the state, Jesus says that what we do to these people is what we do to Jesus himself. Now, you don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to be a religious person. You could use a purely humanistic ethic, a secular ethic, and say that silence in the face of complicity, silence in the face of injustice is complicity in injustice. Of course, Desmond Tutu said this in South Africa in the face of apartheid. But we could look at the ethics of someone like Václav Havel, the first president of Czechoslovakia and then the Czech Republic. He said that love for the neighbor is the shared pillar of our moral vision of all of our contending cultures. So for me to see the suffering of neighbors in Tigray, in Oromia, in Benishangul, in Afar, in the south, we could go on. And to say nothing is to be complicit in those people's suffering. And Getachew, I want to give you one example, my dear brother. In 2008, I was mugged by three men around Girji in Addis. It was at nighttime. One man jumped on me from behind and put his elbow around my neck. The other man cut my legs out from underneath me, and the other man was beating me in the face. Now, in that moment, I desperately wanted someone to come help me. Of course, right? I was powerless, and I was crying out, and I wanted someone to help me. And I committed after that when I would see someone in suffering, I would not be silent and just be like, well, it's none of my business. If I'm a human being, it is my business. If I want to eat, I can't stay silent when someone else is hungry. If I want to go to bed at night in safety, I can't stay silent when someone is afraid of someone knocking on their door. If I want my wife Lily to be safe and protected, I can't be silent when someone's wife or daughter is being raped. But it doesn't have to be wife or daughter. It's just a woman. It's a human being with rights. So why did I raise my voice? I felt a sense of moral responsibility. And sometimes Ethiopians get angry with me and they say, well, you're a white man. Of course, I know I'm a white man. You're not an Ethiopian. I know that. I'm a legal resident of Ethiopia. I'm not an Ethiopian citizen. But for me, it's human. It's human. Again, this goes back to compassion. It goes back to feeling the pain of the other. And I can tell you, Getachew, that so many people were coming to me and telling me their stories about what they were seeing and experiencing. You know, social media has changed the game. People are able to send messages from all around Ethiopia. Of course, it becomes more difficult with the internet blackout. But I'm getting these messages and having this information. And to stay silent, it would just be an act of heartlessness. I don't think it's very complicated, honestly. So I felt a sense of moral responsibility, and for me, it's just basic ethical reasoning. If I wanted someone to do this, if I wanted someone to speak on my behalf, how could I not speak on other people's behalf, whether they're Tigrayan or Chinese or Ukrainian or Mexican? How could I not raise my voice, especially if I have a relationship with the community, which I do?
One thing that related to that question is there are people who go, to great lengths to explain who did what, which group, which act, which reason, which variable, all that, and so on. But in this article, you are looking at the religious dimension and specifically the Christian dimension. So I know some of the reactions that you received are saying, no, this is about one group hating the other group. It has nothing to do with Christianity or Orthodox or, for that matter, the other denominations, all that. So why is it important to have this subject matter out? And for that matter, foreign policy chose to be this on the cover.
Yes. I believe it's extremely important, Getachew. Now, let me make something clear. I said Christian nationalism is tearing Ethiopia apart. I did not say Christian nationalism is the only thing tearing Ethiopia apart. I don't believe in monocausal explanations for complex socio-political reality. Let me say that again, I don't believe in monocausal explanations for complex socio-political reality. There are multiple factors involved. There's money involved. There's identity involved and status involved. There are complex historical grievances and resentments involved. But here's the deal, Getachew, as I see it. And, you know, I'm fallible. I make mistakes, so I'm ready to listen to anybody. Religious nationalism is fundamentally about the same thing that ethnocentrism is about, and that's power. They're both about power. Power is a zero-sum game. It's a competitive relationship with the other that sets up a relationship of us versus them, winner and loser, victim and perpetrator. And what could be more powerful in a power game than to say that God is on our side, that what we are doing is justified by transcendent power. We're not acting on our own. We're obeying God's will. We're saying yes to God's design. We're not acting on our own. We are implementing God's purpose. We are doing so as a righteous act with innocence in the eyes of the highest judge, God. It's hard to imagine a more powerful justification of one's attitudes, one's words, and one's actions than religion. And this boils down to power. Now, in the United States context, people could say, well, how could Christian nationalists support someone like Donald Trump? He's a known cheater. He's cheated on his wife. He's been married multiple times. He's had corrupt business dealings. He's had very clear racist statements. We could go on and on. How could Christian nationalists in the United States partner with Donald Trump? Well, because it's about power. And they saw someone who they thought could help them move towards the achievement of their cultural and political agenda. I think that we see a similar dynamic in Ethiopia today, where religion, the invocation of the name of God, the invocation of the name of the Bible, the words of the Bible, the invocation of biblical and theological images is being used to justify war, justify the killing of people, being used to justify impunity. Getachew, if you claim that God is on your side, it becomes very difficult to question, okay, why are you doing this? Why is it legitimate? Although we know in the Hebrew Bible that even people can question God, but this is not a tradition that many people follow today, of course. So I thought it was important to address Christian nationalism because throughout Ethiopian history, for over 1600 years, the name of God has been invoked to justify the state and the state's violence against the people. This needs to be named, this needs to be challenged. And as you saw in my article, I rooted this back in Emperor Izana, who claimed to be the son of the war god Maharem. You can find this on the inscriptions of Izana in ancient Aksum. Now, when Izana converted to Christianity sometime around 330, he started putting the cross on his coins, and he started calling himself the servant of Christ in his inscriptions. Now, why is this important? Because Izana seemed to undergo some kind of conversion that baptized his empire now in the language of Christianity, in the image of Christianity. We know that the cross was a symbol of execution in the Roman Empire. It was a symbol of suffering, and Jesus chose this as the symbol of his movement to call for radical self-sacrifice and radical nonviolence. But of course, this symbol was weaponized under Constantine in the Roman Empire, and it became weaponized in the ancient Aksumite, we could say Proto-Ethiopian empire. And of course, again, when this religious justification is placed, the leader becomes unquestionable. And you have an extremely powerful motivation for people to submit to this rule and to obey unquestioningly. And Getachew, I can't sketch the whole argument here. I couldn't sketch the whole argument in my foreign policy piece, but what I'm suggesting is that this form of sacral kingship, this form of seeing the ruler as authorized by God to rule and to use violence on God's behalf never ended throughout Ethiopian history. And I suggest that we're seeing something similar with Abiy to this day, where God is being invoked on behalf of the action of the state, on behalf of the action of an unquestionable ruler. And this is done with singing and prayer and smiles and photo shoots. This is done in religious services. And we see the death of children, and we see the raping of women, and we see the looting of factories, and we see the destruction of hospitals. We see the displacement of people in Amhara and Afar and Tigray. So I thought it was important, Getachew, to excavate this history, to uncover that this is an ancient, complex, and difficult problem that needs to be brought to our attention. Are we using religion for power? Are we using religion to justify a political agenda, an ethnic agenda? Or are we using religion to hold ourselves accountable to our highest values, to pursue a greater honesty, and to pursue a greater dignity for each human person? And my concern is that we see religion being mobilized for power, whether it's ethnic power, political power, or otherwise. And again, it needs to be named. In therapy, Getachew, therapists say that when you name something, you tame something. You get that out on the table. Now, I know that this is not very cultural sometimes in some Ethiopian circles. Silence is golden. But the best leaders throughout Ethiopian history, Abba Stephanos, Abuna Petros, Reverend Gudina Tumsa, the Prophet Muhammad himself, they did not accept this philosophy of silence in the face of religious corruption.
I think I'm glad you are, explaining that in terms of why this is important, given, like I mentioned, Ethiopia being a country that claims, one way or the other, maybe dominantly, peaceful people, and
Yeah.
the role of religious leaders, faith leaders, is critical. I mean, historically and even to the present day, people look up to them, and so on. So their role in this, both in
Yes.
the commissioning and in the omissioning parts as well,
That's
is
right.
critical. Maybe let me just, because when it comes to the Orthodox Church, in your article you mentioned about Daniel Kabrat. Even before that, you made a point in a Facebook post from April.
Yes.
Um, on the other side as well, the former prime minister, uh, he, right to what he just spoke about, he talked about divine intervention of, how Abiy Ahmed came to power. Let me play that tape and we'll come back.
የመጀመሪያውና ትልቁ ድጋፌ ጸሎት ነው። እኔ አሁንም ደጋግሜ እላለሁ ይሄ ጉዳይ መለኮታዊ ጣልቃ ገብነት ያለው ነገር ነው ብዬ አምናለሁ። አሁን ጊዜ አለኝ፣ ጤና አለኝ። ስለዚህ በደንብ መንበርከክ እችላለሁ እና ደግሞ በተከታታይና በማያቋርጥ ሁኔታ ማድረግ እችላለሁ። ይሄ ለውጥ እንዳይቀለበስ ያ የዲቫይን ኢንተርቬንሽኑ መቀጠል አለበት ብዬ አምናለሁ። በዚህ እደግፋለሁ። ይሄ ግሌ ነው። ማንም ሊሰጠኝም ሊከለክለኝም የማይችለው የግሌ ኮንቪክሽን ነው። ይሄ ቅድም ብያለሁ፣ ለአንዳንድ ሰዎች ሞኝነት ሊመስል ይችላል። ለኔ ግን ሞኝነት አይደለም። አንዱ እሱ ነው። ሁለተኛ ባገኘሁት አጋጣሚ ሁሉ ክቡር ጠቅላይ ሚኒስትርንም ሌሎች አካላትንም በዚህ ለውጥ ሂደት ውስጥ የኔን ኮንትሪቢዩሽን እዚህ ጋር አድርግ ባሉኝ ቦታ ሁሉ ለማድረግ ራሴን ዝግጁ አድርጌ እየሰራሁ እገኛለሁ።
former Prime Minister, as you know, he wrote as well an article on foreign policy, justifying what was going on, all that in terms of, again, the usual narrative, TPLF versus the rest of Ethiopia. But I had an opportunity to speak on this show with Zito. Zito is the Tanzanian political leader. He is the leader of, I think, the second largest opposition party. He had a privilege, or an opportunity of speaking over the phone with the former prime minister after the war started. Again, the connection was Christian, African, and Zito told me, it's on the show, told me that when he was begging, Haile Mariam to invoke the Christian for, justifying, stopping this war, the suffering and so on, the response he received was, let's pray. While, he was justifying on that. So that dual, thing, that where people feed them their narrative, like you said, they quote this Bible, that Quran, this and so on. But then when it comes to stopping the suffering, showing compassion, and so on, it's not there. So let me just add into that Daniel Kubrat's video, and then you can comment on that aspect.
እነዚህ ሰዎችና እነዚህን ሰዎች የመሰሉ ሰዎች እንዳይደገሙ ማድረግ ነው። እነሱ የመጨረሻ ሆነው እንዲቀሩ፣ ከዚህ በኋላ እነሱን የመሰለ ሰው እንዳይፈጠር መደረግ አለበት። በምንም መልኩ እንደምታውቁት ሰይጣን ከወደቀ በኋላ ሰይጣን የሚመስል ሌላ አልተፈጠረም። ከሰይጣን የመጨረሻው ሆኖ ይቀራል። እነሱ የመጨረሻው ሆኖ መቅረት አለበት። ይሄን ሊደግም የሚችል እንዲህ አይነት አረም ሊያፈራ የሚችል ምንም አይነት መሬት መፈጠር የለበትም እዚች ሀገር። ስለዚህ ሁልጊዜም ቢሆን ለልጆቻችን ከዚህ በኋላ የክፉ ነገር ምሳሌ የማስፈራሪያ ማድረግ ያለብን እነሱን ነው። ከዚህ በፊት ልጆቻችንን እንዲህ ካደረግ ጭራቅ ይበላሃል ብለን ነበር እናስፈራራቸው። አሁን የጭራቅ ዘመን ማለፍ አለ። እነሱ ይበሉሃል ብለን ነው መናገር ያለ። ማስፈራሪያ ነው መሆን ያለባቸው። ሰው እንዳይደግመው፣ እንደነሱ አይነት ሰው ዳግም እንዳይፈጠር እዚች ሀገር እንዳይታሰብ፣ ከመዋቅራዊ ቦታቸው ብቻ አይደለም ማስወገድ ያለብን፣ ከሰው ህሊና፣ ከሰው ልቡና ውስጥ፣ ከታሪክ መዝገብ ውስጥ ነው ተፍቀው መጥፋት ያለባቸው። ምናልባት ስለነሱ የሚያጠና ሰው ወደፊት መሬት ቆፍሮ ያገኝ እንጂ ምንም አይነት ነገር እንዳያገኝ ነው ማድረግ ያለበት። ይሄን ካደረግን ነው ይሄንን ወደ በረከት መቀየር የምንችለው።
So Daniel Kubrat, for our viewers, is a prominent figure in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and he is the social affairs advisor of the Prime Minister. And you mentioned in the article and in your post previously, this is as it can, go in terms of explicit genocidal speech.
It's very difficult to speak after hearing a clip like that, Getachew. It's very heartbreaking. I'd like to say a few things. I want you to notice that there's flowers in the background. Beautiful space, right? There's a band, there's music. He's wearing a suit jacket. It's in a hotel. People are smiling and laughing and clapping. What could be wrong with this? This looks innocent and harmless. Now, I'm an ethicist. I did a PhD at the University of Chicago in religious and political ethics. Sadly, Getachew, I've spent a lot of my life studying horrific evil, like genocides like the Nazi Holocaust, like the Rwandan genocide, like what we saw in Bosnia. There is a pattern to how this violence happens. There's no mystery to it. There's nothing mysterious about genocide. Genocide is predictable, and it has a pattern. What you have to do to commit genocide is to designate a group of people as less than human. Maybe some of your viewers like watching Lord of the Rings. I'm a Lord of the Rings fan. You'll notice that there's lots of killing in the Lord of the Rings. Lots of orcs and goblins are being killed. But I don't think many of us feel bad when we watch Lord of the Rings because we don't think of the orcs as human. So when we see them getting beheaded or burned or stabbed, nobody feels bad. Maybe we even laugh. Maybe we joke. This is the essential step for genocide to become possible. You have to see the other as less than human. And just like Daniel Kibret said, exactly as he said, as a monster, as a devil, as a weed. Now, Getachew, you and I have spent a lot of our life in Ethiopia, so we're very familiar with exorcism, whether anti-Orthodox exorcism, whether Orthodox exorcism, whether Muslim exorcism. When someone has a demon, what do? You cast it out. Daniel Kibret was fulfilling that first crucial step towards genocide. You have to remove the humanity of the other, make them less than human, and once that is done, then organization becomes very easy to mobilize actual violence to begin eradicating people. Like he says, uprooting them, removing them from the earth, removing them from history, removing them from memory. Now, I want to say one other thing, Getachew. Daniel Kibret said, well, I was only talking about TPLF. We're living in the 21st century. So our politicians have become more clever. And it's essential, what we call this plausible deniability. It could also be called dog whistling. What this means is that you say something that is inciting extreme violence, but you leave a loophole open to yourself to say, no, I didn't mean that. No, I wasn't calling for genocide. I was just talking about our so-called political enemy. But let's say that you have a barn and it's full of hay, and you light a match in one corner of the barn, and then the whole barn burns down. You say, no, I didn't burn down the barn. I only lit one match. But of course, we know that only one match is needed to start genocidal violence. It's to make the other less than human. And this is what Daniel Kibret has done. Now, Daniel Kibret is a very prominent religious leader in Ethiopia. He's a significant leader behind Mahabir Kiddusan, the Communion of Saints, this important Orthodox youth group. I know people who are part of Mahabir Kiddusan. There's good people who are part of Mahabir Kiddusan. I'm not trying to paint with a single brush here, but we know that this is a group that is seeking to restore Orthodox hegemony. And so this man brings, again, Getachew, you asked me, why is Christian nationalism important? He brings this authority of being a religious figure, a scholar, someone who represents God's will, someone who is pursuing righteousness. And he does it on a beautiful stage with flowers, with music, with people clapping and laughing. And then he gives the essential match for igniting genocide, but he does it with enough plausible deniability that he can then say, well, no, I didn't do this. Now let's bring Haile Mariam back into this. Haile Mariam says that this is divine intervention. Again, how do you argue with that? If it's God's will for Abiy to be the prime minister of Ethiopia, how do you argue with that? There's no argument to be had. It's absolute. It's unquestionable. It becomes a matter of submission, just like we saw with Isana, I'm the son of God. When you have these theological claims being made on behalf of political power loses all accountability. And you see things like Daniel Kibret, you see speeches like Daniel Kibret's, and you say, well, if this is because of divine intervention, then how can we criticize it? And so you have silence, you have hard-heartedness, or you have what we saw in the audience, which it breaks my heart, Getachew, laughing, clapping, applauding. People wanted to hear Daniel say this, and he knew that. And he gave the audience what they wanted. So let's not give Daniel too much credit here. he was also, there's a supply and a demand issue here. Daniel was also giving the people what they wanted to hear. And I'm told that Daniel is actually a quite moderate Orthodox leader compared to some others who are even more extreme and even more bigoted than Daniel Kibret. So what I was trying to say, Getachew, was there's no mystery to genocidal violence. It follows a pattern. And we're seeing that pattern play out today. And in case people think that I'm being, alarmist or exaggerating, Genocide Watch, this is an organization established by rigorous academics and others, places Ethiopia now in stage 5 of genocide, that's organization, stage 9 of genocide, that's elimination, and stage 10 of genocide, that's denial. Denial is always the final stage of genocide. You do it, and then you say, no, we didn't. It didn't happen. You're making it up. You're exaggerating. No, we're the victim. Look how you're trying to paint us as evil. This is what we're seeing in Ethiopia today. And multiple groups are claiming genocide against them. As I said in my article, we see this in Tigray. We see this being claimed in Amhara. We see this being claimed in Oromia and elsewhere. This clip, Getachew, will end up in a museum someday about how this horrible, horrible violence became possible.
Yeah, going back to your article, Andrew, you mentioned a couple of times here as well, where you thought this all started, the what you call Christian nationalism. You go back to Izana, and I have preparing for this one. I was looking at what the literature has been saying, and I chatted with you as well on where I think all this started, because my personal experience as a member of the Orthodox Church, I have been close to Daniel and all the likes, within Mahabharata and so on. I have done a number of shows on this, and I had to speak up in public as well, like you said, because I felt responsible in to the extent that this kind of thought, this kind of audacity to just in public say this, and cruelty, all that, in my view, didn't come out of the blue.
No.
There must have been some deep social, cultural, religious ground. So I go back to, let's say, 13th century, and this is
Yes.
one of the sites you mentioned, Donald Crummy. When he finishes his article, he actually talks about what you were saying earlier. In 19th century Ethiopia, as in other parts of Africa, religion played a major role in legitimating political reconstruction, but with equal force, political power helped define religious truths. So you cite, Izana, and then you mentioned about Boru Meda and so on. I saw a number of reactions, and actually I had to go to the sources you cited. Uh, we can talk about maybe the inaccuracies here, errors there, all that, or the framing and so on. But what I and I was thinking about, this, and I did a number of shows, is clearly the coming together of the church and the state.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of connecting to each other through land, in the 13th century, that
Yes.
unleashed, in my view, a series of massacres, small, big, here and there, changing the victims. Sometimes the narrative could be political, in other times it could be religious, and so on. So what, in my view, is happened in large scale and unprecedented scale in Tigray, there were seeds of massacres over the century. So this citation from Donald Cramy, I mean, even if again we can question whether it was only 19th century Ethiopia
Right.
or so on, but there is that, component there, historical component. So can you speak to um, when you had to look back and look at, the moment that you felt like there must be something that was, in the history as well. Uh, and I question, the length of period you covered, but take us to the moment where it came to your mind, okay, there must be something historical.
Yeah. Everything is historical, Getachew. There's that famous quote, the past isn't past, it's still with us. This is collective memory. This is the role of legend and myth. When I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, I was privileged to do 3 one-on-one tutorials with Professor Donald Levine. I have great respect for Gash Lieben, as he was affectionately called. Gash Lieben.
But I
Gash
think
Lieben.
at one point, I think he said Fitorari Liban was the name he was given, but he said no, it should be Gash Liban, right? Continue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Gash Lieben Gebra Ethiopia.
I met him. I had the privilege of meeting him and Bill Levin, his son, actually
Yeah.
on their birthday, and it was something that remained in my mind when he said Ethiopia missed a number of opportunities
Right.
from the 1953, 1970 to all that and so on. So I know Gash Liban. Okay, continue.
Dear listeners out there, if all you get out of this show is to read Gash Lieben's piece, Ethiopia's Missed Opportunities, please go read it. It's very relevant. Levine was very insightful. So I was at the University of Chicago, and as you know, it's a rigorous school. Some schools may have you read a few books a semester. Levine was having me read a few books a week. And we were systematically going through Ethiopian history. And I was reading the Royal Chronicles of Ethiopia. Now, this is something that's a little bit special about Ethiopia, is that you have this history of indigenously written records of the king's rules and what they said and did. This is not foreign propaganda. This is what the king's own courts were writing about the rulers. So I was reading this material. I was reading the historical context. I was, reading people like Bahuru Zodi and others, people like Tedessa Tamrat, Church and State in Ethiopia, and others, many, many scholars. And I just started to notice this pattern that the king always had this kind of divine, unquestionable status that set up a kind of leadership pattern that couldn't be contested. It was absolute. And this set up a pattern of either submission or rebellion. When leadership is absolute, you can either only submit or you have to rebel. Both create a pattern of resentment. Let's say, Getachew, that you're bullying me now here on the show. I could either sign off and say, I'm out, or I can start cursing you back and insulting you, and then we get into a shouting match. Either way, that's going to create resentment between us, and we're not going to be happy with each other. We saw this pattern in the rulers of this kind of absolute divine rule. I think Zara Yacob is a really significant one. But this pattern then of revolt, conquest, and then revolt, and then just cyclical violence, with, of course, more people dying, which created more poverty. Where the historic Ethiopian famines come from, these heartbreaking episodes in Ethiopian history, they're usually in the wake of war, where you have crops being destroyed by soldiers and people not being able to sow their land, which is again what we're seeing in Tigray today. It's very reminiscent of the late 19th century and other periods in Ethiopian history. Let me be clear. I started reading this history very systematically, very extensively, very carefully, and I kept seeing this pattern of this kind of absolute leadership on behalf of the king, justified in the name of God. And then it was extremely striking to me, Getachew, that in Haile Selassie's 1931 and 1955 constitution, he explicitly names it. Haile Selassie gives us the clearest formulation that we have of it in history. I believe it's in Article 4, where he says that the person of the emperor is sacred and his power indisputable. We can go back, though, and trace this into Kebra Negest. Unfortunately, my article had a word limit. I wanted to discuss the Kebra Negest, the glory of kings, the story of Menelik I and the founding of the Ethiopian dynasty. I wanted to discuss the Fetaha Negest, the medieval law code that became the basis of Ethiopian polity until the time of Haile Selassie. And I especially wanted to discuss Tekla Haimanot and Yakuno Amlak. Now, you were just alluding to them a few seconds ago. As the listeners will know, there was a transfer of power from the rulers that were kind of based in Lalibela. They're called different things. Zagwe dynasty, there's different names to refer to them. But in 1970, there was this power transition. I had this in my article, Getachew, but it got cut out because of the word length. Tekla Haimanot, this very powerful monk, brokered a power transition between the Zagwe dynasty to this new Solomonic dynasty under this ruler, Yakuno Amlak. And in exchange for this power brokerage, Yakuno Amlak famously said, a third to the state, a third to the soldiers, and a third to the church. He was referring to the land. A third of the land belonged to the emperor, a third of the land belonged to the military, and a third of the land belonged to the church. Now, people have been so angry at me, Getachew, because I said that Orthodox started to feel some anxiety and some disinheritance as we see Islam taking up greater public prominence, and as we saw the Pente movement growing from a very small minority to 20 million people. But what I had in mind was this very old belief that a third of the land of Ethiopia belongs to the church by right of this power brokerage done by Tekla Haimanot, which then, we have a Yakuno Amlak, and then we get to Amda Tzion. And I referred to his chronicle in my article, where you have gruesome descriptions of the massacre of Muslims in the name of Selassie, in the name of the Trinity. So for me, Getachew, I started studying the history with Gash Lieben, and I saw this pattern of what we can call, I call it sacral kingship. Gash Lieben called it pharaonic leadership, the kind of pharaoh-style leadership where the leader has this absolute authority that is justified in the name of God. This then authorizes the violence of the state, which leads to the expansion of the empire, which leads to great resentment, which leads to, of course, the escalation of conflict and fighting, which leads to poverty and to famine. And if that doesn't sound like today, it just does sound like today to me. And we see, like you said, Haile Mariam saying this is divine intervention. I quoted Abi in my article, him saying that he was expanding the kingdom of God through this evangelical council of Ethiopia, this prophecy of him being the seventh king, and many, many evangelical and Orthodox leaders saying that God has sent Abi to Ethiopia to essentially make Ethiopia great again and restore the divine glory. So it all began in the historical studies and just saying there's an unmistakable pattern here of this kind of absolutist leadership, almost always in the name of God and almost always in the name of the greatness of Ethiopia.
I think, when it comes to reading a long history of a country as complex as Ethiopia, there would definitely be a number of arguments, debates, all that. But
Of course.
getting to the crux of the matter in terms of where did it start, how did it start? For me, there are two. If we have to be selective, we can read, like it said, that power transfer, what it led to, and what it meant to this day. Actually, to this day, the ownership of land. Where did the church, for example, in just forgetting the little man in all
Yes.
the, and just dancing to the tunes of the palace,
Yes.
no matter what. I think that is the time where everything changed. I shared with you that I want to share with our audience as well. A very famous author in Ethiopian literacy, literary is Haddis Alamayo, the late Haddis Alamayo. I came to read his speech made just a year after TPLF coalition controlled Addis, like 31, 32 years ago. So he spoke about the Ethiopia, of the last 1,000, and the Ethiopia before that.
Yep.
He spoke about Ethiopia that was, glorified by the Greeks, in the Bible, in that literature here, all that. And he says it doesn't go together with the Ethiopia we know now,
Hmm.
in terms of just pushing the poor, the elites of the time, the centuries, working together to always, um, take advantage of the poor. So he,
Yes.
he was trying to reconcile, that Ethiopia and the Ethiopia he came to know, he write about his famous, translated into English novel is the Fikr Ska Maqabr, Love Unto Grave. And even in that, if you read it carefully without, uh, being deceived by the love affair there, or what Teddy Afro sang as, Sabliye. If you are not into that business, you would see how this man, documented well the suffering of the peasants, the masses, and so on. So, in that speech, that woke me up into reading a lot and getting into the core of all this. He talks about uh, how that Ethiopia before that 1,000 years ago was with compassion. I mean, you are mentioning about Izana and so on, but mind you, this is a nation, a kingdom that welcomed Islam and even, provided protection, right, from whatever was happening to them at that time. So even you can see it in Tigray or in other parts of Ethiopia, that seed of, what was in the past. But with the church and the state coming together, and they didn't come together for, heavenly reason or that. It was power and politics, right?
Yeah.
So that changed everything. And not only that, because what we see in this very interesting article by Memre Menasamai, he's talking about the 15th century. He's talking about the Panos, the time of the Ryakov.
Yes.
Again, you will see power and politics, religion, state and the power coming together, state and church coming together to massacre them, to,
Yes.
kill them all. But what you see in this article is, and in Getachews Haile 1983 publication is, they were questioning the church's ownership of land and working closely to the palace. But of course, any justification that was given to kill them and to massacre them was religious. So my point is, there are, timelines to all this, where
Yes.
things become kind of normalized with these two houses, so to speak, the house of politics and the house of, religion, coming together to undermine anything that is against this cross-fertilization of these two houses. So going back to the article, you talk about how that, relatively, is coming into the Protestant, evangelism, and so on, and even working together. Daniel is still Orthodox Church,
Yes.
figure, but he's working closely with the Pavlov group again to justify whatever is the palace and the church doing together. So, how did you understand the historical, as we put it, and what's happening now? And we are over the hour, but I mean, I don't want to cut it without asking you, what do you see should be done? Who should do what? We have seen, you mentioned in your article how Abuna Matthias, the head of, the most powerful church, I would say, oldest, largest church still in Ethiopia, maybe arguably also in, other, in the continent, was silenced from speaking up about criminalization of Tigrayans and so on. So what do you see should be done as we, finish this show today?
Getachew, I want to say thank you for having me on. Thank you for your thoughtful questions. Thank you for facilitating critical dialogue. I believe that the primary problem facing Ethiopia today is othering. And I describe othering as seeing others as unrelated or less than myself or my group. This can be done along religious lines, so you're not Pente, you're not Orthodox, you're not Muslim, so you're other. It can be done along ethnic or identitarian lines. You're not this ethnic group or that ethnic group, so you're other. It can be done along political party lines and affiliation. Othering is tearing Ethiopia apart, and we're seeing this othering being supercharged here by this religious nationalism that I'm trying to describe. I believe that the solution is to rediscover our shared moral vision. Now, we can go back to Hebrew scripture, and the prophet Moses said, love your neighbor as yourself. In the context of Leviticus 19, it's clear that that neighbor is the blind, the poor, the daily laborer, as you said, the peasant, the impoverished worker, and also the foreigner. We get to the New Testament with Jesus Christ. He says, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy. Why? So that you can be children of your Father in heaven. God is a lover of the enemy. And so to be God's children, we must love our enemies. We get to the time of the Prophet Muhammad. The Holy Quran says, be good to neighbors near and far. This is a powerful moral vision. Even if you don't live next to me, even if I'm in Addis and you're up in Tigray, or you're down in Omo, or you're over in Harar, or you're over in Walega, you're still my neighbor and you have moral value in the eyes of God. Prophet Muhammad said in a hadith that the most virtuous behavior in the eyes of God is to forgive those who wrong you, to give to those who take from you. Now we can go to our secular moral tradition. I already mentioned Václav Havel, who said that this is our shared moral tradition, seeing the other as a neighbor. A neighbor is someone who is connected to us, who has moral value to us. If we are to be people of authentic faith, we must put the neighbor over power. We must put the dignity of the other over our agendas to control status and wealth and privilege for our own sakes. And so I think, Getachew, that the solution moving forward, one of the solutions, let me not be oversimplistic, one of the solutions is the healing of our moral vision, to not be seeing the other as a weed, as a monster, as a demon, but to see the other as a complex diamond that has depth, that has complexity, but has precious value. Why? Because that person is created and loved by God. And I'd like to just conclude, if I may, Getachew. Jesus is arrested by the empire and the religious leaders on bogus charges. You know, the Gospels, Getachew, it says that the religious leaders and the political leaders became friends in the execution of Jesus. This is the pattern of scapegoating. Find that common enemy and then ruin them. And that's how you achieve so-called unity. Jesus is arrested. Jesus is put before a kangaroo court. Jesus is tortured. And then Jesus is put on a Roman cross, the most atrocious form of execution, like we're seeing executions in Ethiopia today. What does Jesus say? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They're lost. They're out of control. They have been blinded. And Jesus speaks a word of compassion in the face of atrocity. I believe, Getachew, we need to discover this radical compassion that moves from the imperial violence of political rulers and religious leaders crucifying the powerless to this courageous, rebellious, defiant act of compassion that says, Father, forgive. They are lost. They're addicted. They're out of control. They don't know what they're doing. Let us start over again. Let us make a new beginning. And I believe that seeing the other as a neighbor can help us heal othering and make a new beginning, whether we're Muslim, God bless my Muslim sisters and brothers, whether we're Orthodox, God bless my Orthodox sisters and brothers. I've got my Lalibela cross right here. God bless my Pente sisters and brothers. We're not others. We're not enemies. We're neighbors who are created for relationship for the common good in a diverse, multinational, inclusive, just Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for your time. And there is a lot to explore in that article. It's a long article that touched upon the different groups citing who said what and the historical aspects as well and so on. But I think this is a good start, and we want everyone to contribute into this conversation in understanding the complexity, the dynamics, and most importantly, hold those responsible accountable. You were mentioning about some of these speeches, especially at this day and age with our digital footprint all over the place. I think who said what, who did what is there for everyone in the future to see and to archive. So we do really hope that common sense, which unfortunately has been uncommon these days, to prevail, and also for those who, you know, are committing and justifying all this genocidal rhetoric and action to be held accountable, and for the poor, for the masses that have been, enormously suffering in all this, to get peace and to get love and so on. And Andrew, thank you so much, and hopefully we'll reconnect for another conversation on this subject and related subject matter.
I'd be honored, Getachew. Let's have another conversation. I pray for peace in Ethiopia for all of the women and children. May compassion, accountability, justice, truth, healing, and dignity prevail in Ethiopia.
Thank you. You have been following us live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and all other channels, platforms. My conversation with Andrew DeCort, who recently wrote an article on the foreign policy, and the title of the article was Christian Nationalism is Tearing Ethiopia Up, and we conversed under the topic In God's Name, Anatomy of Demonization and Radioactive Enmity in Ethiopia. Thank you for following us. Share, subscribe, like, so that many can access our material. UMD Media strives to create an evidence-led discourse and decision-making in the Horn of Africa. I will see you in yet another show. Bye.